So I've done my spiel. I'm still on time, so that's good. So we'll focus on panel 1, and that's on the application process. So we have Rovana Popov, Tunde Alawode, and Chiamaka Obianyo that will discuss the application process. So this is what do you need to know to be successful in this program. And they will introduce themselves, but I have their details here. Also, I've listed it based on their appearance, so it makes it easier for you to follow. So Rovana Popov is a Senior Associate Dean and the Acting Dean of Students in my department, the Pritzker School of Molecular Engineering at the University of Chicago. Tunde Alawode is currently a consultant at McKinsey. If you don't know him, you should know him by this point. He has 3 degrees from MIT, so I only put 2 of them because there was no space for the third one. So he has a PhD, a Master's of Science in Mechanical Engineering, and also has a Master's of Science in Material Science and Engineering from MIT. He did his bachelor's as he was a valedictorian at Unilag with mechanical engineering, and also kind of a semi-mentor of mine. Always go to him for advice. Yeah. And Chiamaka Obianyo, currently a PhD student at Georgia Tech. Is an incoming scientist at Dow Chemical Company, and I've known Chiamaka since she was a sophomore in undergraduate. So, and she did her Bachelor's of Science in Chemical Engineering at Texas Tech. And so with that, Chiamaka has the presentation she will give to all of us. And then once she's done, but even while she's speaking, Tunde and Rovana, please jump in. And then after the presentation is done, we'll also have like somewhat of a panel discussion where we'll ask some of the questions that the students have listed earlier on. Okay, so Chiamaka, I'll let you take over. You can tell us more about the US-PhD application process.
Oh, let me share my screen. All right, we good? Everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So my name is Chiamaka, and just like adding what Chibueze said, Tunde was also a mentor of mine and Chibueze, so it's really nice to be here today with them. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech, and I'm just going to start up the conversation on what it takes to be able to get what a grad school application process looks like. All right. Some of the things they're going to try and address today based on the questions that were asked. Why graduate school? So why should you consider graduate school? What does the application process look like? And there was a lot of questions about funding. So who gets to pay for the PhD? And then once we've covered all those, we'll hopefully look at what the actual process of getting a PhD looks like. And so with that, we will start. All right, so we're all here, or at least a lot of you are towards the end of your degree, and you're looking to transition from a bachelor's to a graduate degree. And you're probably asking, well, like what happens now? Hopefully you're actually asking this question way before you graduate. Although in Nigeria, it's a little different. So maybe as in your final year, being here right now is exactly when you should be asking the question. You want to ask it at least a year before you intend to start graduate school. And so in America, typically the fall semester begins in August. So if you're looking at coming to graduate school in August of 21, then August 20 is probably the latest time you want to start thinking about it. Ideally, you actually want to be thinking about applying way before so that you can get all the materials ready and make yourself a good enough student for when that time comes. There's also the spring semester, which is in January, but most of you will be admitted and most of the people actually start the program in August. Okay, so this is just a sample timeline for why the application process takes a long time. So why it takes up to a year for you to get admitted. And this is really based on an American education. So the summer before your senior year, that's the summer before the last full year you have before you start your graduate program. One of the things that you start doing is to like work on your personal statement, so your statement of purpose. Then you explore the graduate programs to see what that looks like. And you even start some GRE prep. And if you don't know what any of that means, just give me a few slides and we'll understand what it all means. And then around September, you start registering for the GRE and then narrowing down your like program choices, and then you take the GRE. And then in December, you submit your applications. So between December and January, the deadlines to submit a lot of the grad school applications for both PhD and master's students. And between January and March and April is really when you hear back from the graduate programs about whether you've been admitted or not. And then April 15th is when you have to accept or decline the admission. And then between April and August, when you finally do start, is when you do all the visa applications and your visa interview to make you eligible to come. So it's a really long process, which is why it's important to start thinking about it very early on.
And just to jump in there, this is Tunde. So this timeline is mostly for students who study in the US. I believe it was designed for them. Yeah. Students in Nigeria, situation is usually special. There are other things to consider. So for example, you might want to get some other things in place before you even think about, taking a GRE. Some of you may know that these exams require you to have a passport. So such a simple thing could take you some time to get. So start thinking about getting a passport long before you need to start writing your exams. Then there are also some other things like getting your transcripts. A lot of schools, will give you your transcripts 5 months after you ask for it. Some might be faster, but I've heard of cases where it takes many months for you to get a transcript. So please think about that. So your school, you know how other people before you have done it and how long it took them. So just factor all those in. If it takes a year in your school, then just apply as early as you can. Then the final point there, someone asked in the questions that Chibueze sent us, someone asked about what if we don't have money to pay for all the applications and the exams. Now, there is something called Education USA. It's an arm of the US Embassy in Lagos and Abuja, the consulate in Lagos and embassy in Abuja. And they have something called the Opportunity Fund that can be used to fund all this stuff. So basically, you just don't pay anything at all throughout the process. So they fund your TOEFL, your GRE, and all of your applications. Now, the deadline for applications for that is usually end of May, and it opens middle of April. So if you miss that, then there's nothing for you for that year, right? So factor that kind of thing into your calculations. I just sent a link on the chat for the applications for this year that's already passed. But for next year, just make sure that you're aware of this like this. And that's it.
Thank you, Tunde. Very good points. I also went to Education USA, but for 8 years ago before I came for undergrad. Okay. So the first question I figured we would address is why graduate school? So why should you go do more school after your bachelor's? And there are really many different reasons people go to graduate school. I think so on this figure on the left is just some of the ideal responses, this particular author has said. So you go to graduate school, maybe because it's necessary in your field to get a graduate degree. Maybe getting a graduate degree will result in a promotion. Maybe graduate school suits you personally. And you might be wondering, well, what does it mean for graduate school to suit me personally? And we'll talk about that soon. But also maybe you're just really curious about wanting to learn, do more research in a particular area. So those are some of the reasons people go to graduate school. And like I said, it's very personal for everybody. But I think even more important than why you should go to graduate school is the reasons not to go to graduate school. So don't get a PhD because your parents think it's a great idea to get a PhD. Don't go to graduate school to please someone else. Like, it's nice, but you need a lot of grades to survive the PhD process, and just doing it for that reason isn't going to be enough. The other thing I would add to that is I totally agree with this point that says like you shouldn't go because you only want to earn more money. That again may or may not be enough to keep you through the grueling process of a PhD. That being said, though, there's this chat on the bottom which is purposefully small, but this is on an American like scale, like systems, like a high school diploma, and about $38,000, which is probably a lot in Naira, but just bear with me for a second and don't do the conversion. A bachelor's degree ends about like the average of 62K. I'm not cutting to this chart. And a doctoral degree, so getting like a PhD, you earn $30,000 more. So getting a graduate degree does give you more earning pay, but that shouldn't be the only reason you go to graduate school. And I think throughout this workshop and in the rest of the panels, you would hear some of the reasons why people chose to go to graduate school. All right, so now we're going to move into the overview of the PhD application process and with some tidbits about a master's too. One of the top questions that we got is, do you need a master's degree to apply? And the answer to that is really not necessarily. So a lot of people go to the PhD program straight from their bachelor's. And in my PhD incoming class, maybe 2 out of the 35 of us who were admitted that year had a master's. The thing that makes you stand out, the reason why people can do that is because you have a really strong GPA. And we're going to again look at what GPA cutoffs are like. So you have a really strong GPA and you have very good research experiences. Those are the two things that can allow you to do that. Now, I've met people, there are people who do get a master's degree first before going to the PhD. And I think some of the reasons people do that is maybe your bachelor's GPA wasn't too like hot, so you do a master's degree so you can like do more coursework, get higher GPA. Maybe you're also considering changing fields, and so if you're going to go from biology to computer science, for instance, like you probably need to do a master's and to take some like core computer science classes. Those are some of the reasons people get a master's degree before going to a PhD. But most of the time, the answer is no. You can just go from a bachelor's to a PhD. The second very popular question we got with that is, can you get a master's degree along the way? And in most programs, the answer is yes. Tunde got 2 masters along the way. And some people do, some people don't. So it depends on the school and the program. So you hear a lot about it depends on the program you're at, because even though there's a general overview of what a graduate application process looks like, every school, every department is just slightly different from the next. So in some programs, you just have to take 1 or 2 more classes or even no classes to get a master's degree in that field as you're going. So I thought we'll get that out of the way now.
Sorry, just to add to that. So there are a lot of schools where you can only apply for straight PhDs, but there are also some schools where you can only apply for masters. Only some departments, they can only apply for masters first. So my department at MIT was one of those. So there were no straight PhDs, and there are no straight PhDs in MIT's mechanical engineering department. But when you get in for your masters, getting into the PhD program just means writing a letter and saying, I want to do it, right? There's no more serious application from that point on. So it's effectively being admitted for the PhD, but you're given a way out if you don't want to continue beyond your master's, right? I actually do prefer that model because PhDs take a long time, and most people, sometimes people change their mind, and having kind of a time when you have to actually decide to do it, I think is a good thing. But this program is about those applying for research in general, and whatever one you choose, you should be fine. But if you get in and you don't want to finish, that is, you know, sometimes people do that as well and get a master's and leave.
Yeah, so just to confuse people even more, so even within MIT, in a different department, so chemical engineering, that was my department. So we'd actually, if you get admitted to the master's program, it's actually frowned upon to transfer to the PhD. They want you to go back out of the system and apply for a PhD, because we have the PhD direct option. So most people in MIT chemical engineering apply directly for the PhD, and you can get a master's if you leave the PhD program. But then there's also a different master's program that you can get on the side. But if you were to get that, so there's a Master's of Science in Chemical Engineering Practice that you can get at MIT, but they don't want you to transfer from that Master's of Science in Chemical Engineering Practice to the PhD program. Most of the time you would have to go back out and apply as a PhD student to get in. But if you were to apply to the PhD program, you can get that master's by doing one more class. So what this is basically saying is that as you look at universities, you will see that departments, especially for graduate programs, have their own rules. So you cannot assume that MIT as an institution has the same rules for all the different departments.
Very true. So every department is always slightly different. Okay. So we've covered that. So the next questions that's probably brimming in your mind is, well, like, how do I begin? I want to get a PhD. So like, where do I start? The first thing to do is to probably like find schools. You want to first do some introspection and figure out what types of research are interesting to you. So maybe it's something you did for your final year project, or an area that has just been like on your mind for a long time. So figure out what areas of research is interesting to you, because you're going to be doing that for a long time. And then the next thing you want to do after that is to just Google what are the like top US. So this is like one of my favorite websites, like best US news rankings, and they have it for each department. So in chemical engineering, what are the top like graduate programs there, and the list goes on and on, the different kinds. But then that's just supposed to be your starting list. That doesn't mean that you apply to like the top 10 schools only or at all. You just have to, so use that as a list of schools that have that's trying to do what you want. And then from that list, you can do a research to see what schools have the types of things you're interested in. So like if you're interested in energy, go to like that list and see which schools have a strong energy program. And then I would say like reach out to current graduate students. So for every school's website, you can always see what the current graduate students are or who they are. Bonus if you find a Nigerian or someone that looks like they would be like friendly to like reach out. So you can always get their emails and reach out to them. LinkedIn is also, had a couple of people reach out to me on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is also a tool we can use to connect to like graduate students in a school you're interested in to see what the process is like for them and how they found the process there. And then you can always, I think something to also keep in mind when you're looking at schools and trying to figure out on which to apply to is to try and find out if you can see what the graduate students do afterwards. This is something I didn't really think about a lot, but every school is like slightly different. It's like every department within every school is slightly different in where their graduate students lean. So at Georgia Tech, I would say in my chemical engineering department, 70% of the people go into industry and 30% go into academia. And so what that means is 70% go and get like jobs for companies, but 30%, would go and try and be professors. So every school, that number is slightly different. So depending on what you want to do with your PhD, it's also important to think about that question. And then the last thing I was going to say is, I mentioned it a few slides earlier, but application deadlines for most PhD applications are like December and January. And so you really want to have everything done by then. And these are hard deadlines. So if your recommendation letter isn't in by then, I don't really know how that's going to go. For master's students, the application deadlines is a bit later. So I think it's like February, March, April is the application deadlines. Yeah, does anyone want to add anything? Okay, cool. So with that, we'll move on to the minimum admission requirements, and take everything here with a grain of salt. This is just what I've seen from my research. I would say that, so these are just the things or the components of your applications that strongly that are required, right? Or that I've seen. So a bachelor's degree, so you have to have a bachelor's degree. A competitive GPA based on like my classmates and people, you know, who have gotten in is a 3.5 out of a 4.0 on an American scale. And I would say that that translates loosely to maybe around a 4.2 or higher, over 5.0. And today, feel free to correct me. And with that, you also need to send in your transcript. So like what Tunde said about requesting for your transcripts early, so that it gets in time for the graduate department, for the graduate application. You also need a statement of purpose, but there's a whole workshop on that after this, so I won't say anything more than that. And then you need to write entrance exams. So the GRE, which is really just the standardized test that everybody has to take. So both international students and Americans have to do the GRE, and they try and use it to grade everyone on the same scale. But very excitingly, we were just discussing this earlier, a lot of schools, a lot of departments are beginning to waive GRE scores. And so this is really exciting because this is like one less thing you have to worry about. But the GRE is something that may be required where you're going. And for most international students, the TOEFL is also required. So they require you to do a test of English as a foreign language, which is slightly different from the GRE, but not too different, and it's totally doable. A competitive GRE score. So there are two components of the GRE, or there are three components. There's the math, the English, and the writing. The math and the English are weighted on a 170 scale. So the total is typically 170. And a competitive GRE score is having greater than a 158 in both of those, but really much higher. So a lot of people have like 165 out of 170 in the math in particular, if you're interested in engineering. Some of the tips I would say is to dedicate at least a month or more to prepare and study. And it also helps to look up, so if the score is still accepting GREs, look up what the average GRE range of the incoming PhD class is in that department, and then see how you're doing. That can give you a good idea of whether that school is a good fit for you, or whether that school, you know, maybe one of the rich schools that you want to get. The last thing I would say about the GRE is like, don't stress about it. It's just a test. It's a good test to do good on, but you don't need to have a perfect score. And I know people who like try to take the GRE like 3 times or like more than 2 times to try and get like a better score. That's really not required. It's just one component of this long list of the admissions package, of the applications package. So do your best, but don't stress about it.
Just to jump in, I stressed about it. So in all of this stuff on this list, there are 2 things that you have full control over: statement of purpose and your test scores. You've probably already done your research. So what's that's already done. Your GPA is probably not going to change much before you graduate. So I would say get as high as you can. If you can get a perfect score, I would say you should try to get it. And the other thing is, just for some people, 1 month is enough. Know yourself. Know where your circumstances are. When I wrote the GRE, I was working. I was actually working in McKinsey at that time. It's an interesting trajectory. I was working full time, and I only had like 30 minutes in the morning, maybe 30 minutes at night, maybe some weekends to actually study. So I gave myself, I think, 4 months before I actually wrote the exam. I actually wrote it during NYSC camp. Anyway, just know where you are. So take a practice test know how much work you have to do, then do that work. Set a date, take the tests, score as high as you possibly can. If you don't score, I don't know, 330 in total, like it's not the end of the world, but it does help if you do get above 330. But if you get 310 or you get 305 or you get 320, you make do with what you are able to get and you focus on other areas. But if you can, please try.
Yeah, so Rovana, yeah, it's a good time for you to, especially as somebody who sees it from the other side. So most of us are students who are applying. From you that's been in the room where where you're making decisions on who to admit. And if you can comment on like what are some of these requirements that are most important for us to focus on.
So first I want to follow up on the GRE score. For international students, the GRE score is actually really important. Why? Because most Americans have no clue about universities around the world and the caliber of those universities. They're very American-centric with the exception of a few schools in Europe. And so if they get a transcript from a school abroad, they just don't have a way of evaluating what that means. And chances are they don't have colleagues at that university. Also, the GPA, it just, even within the United States, you can have a 4.0 at one school and it doesn't equal a 4.0 at another school. And so the GRE score becomes important in terms of calibrating where you fit in with other applicants. And so I'd actually stress that the GRE score is pretty important. And even for those schools that are waiving the GRE score, if you feel like you're really strong and you have really good training, it will actually give you an edge to go ahead and take the GRE and submit that score. Now, if you're not sure and you're struggling with the GRE, then no, don't do it. But if you're a strong student and you're confident and you're coming from a good school, the GRE score is a significant bit of information that will help an American audience understand your training and the knowledge that you're bringing. So that's super, super important. I know for students in the United States, it's a different issue, but that's because they're coming from schools that many of the faculty on these admissions committees are aware of. The other thing I'd say is for the statement of purpose, actually when the faculty are evaluating whether or not a student should be admitted, they're looking at something called fit. And so they want to know, is this student a good fit for our department? And what does fit mean? It means, are they academically prepared? Will they fit in with our academic culture and expectations? And will they be pursuing the kinds of outcomes that we're preparing our students for? And so how do they get that information and answer the question? So there's a GRE score that answers in part the question of, are they academically prepared? There's the record of research experience, which was alluded to already, but that's actually super, super, super important. And so there are students who have very high GRE scores, but no real record of research experience, and they're just not seen as competitive applicants because there are students who know how to take tests, there are students who know how to get good grades, but they're not necessarily the same students who know how to come up with original research ideas, manage research projects, and work within a lab. And that's what you're training to do. You're training to become a researcher. And so sometimes we have people who have a perfect GPA and perfect GRE scores, and they tank. They just fail when they enter graduate school because they don't know how to work independently. They don't know how to navigate lab dynamics, and they don't have original ideas. They know how to learn a set of material and give that back. So that's really, really important. So you share that comes through your letters of recommendation. So you'll get letters of recommendation from faculty and others who've supervised your research. But that also comes through in your personal statement. So you'll talk about why you want to pursue a PhD, why you want to pursue a PhD in this field, and why you want to pursue a PhD in this field at this university in this department. And so you absolutely research universities, you want to research the department, but I'll say take it a step further. you want to research who the faculty are in that department. And so in your statement of purpose, you'd say, I'd really like to work at this department because it's making advances in the field of energy and material science. In particular, Professor X and Professor Y and Professor Z are really engaged in research in the way that I want to approach it, or they're really advancing research in this area, and I would love to work with any of them.
Yeah.
That's super, super important. I think somebody's trying to jump in.
Yes, I think we have a statement of purpose panel where I think Tunde and Olamide will really emphasize that, because I think one of the points you've made is, so Chiamaka, if you go back one more on your slides, kind of like when you had all the list of stuff. Yeah, exactly. So you've basically said for international students, faculty don't know their universities. So that devalues the GPA, unless it's like very, very high, unless somebody knows that the University of Lagos is a very top school and that a 4.9 means amazing student. Unless the faculty know that, they devalue that GPA. For GRE this year, so most schools are not even accepting the GRE. So then how can these international students really stand out and also some of them, and I think we have a student section, a student panel, maybe later in the afternoon, where most of our students may not have research experience. They have they've worked in many different jobs. So I think a good thing that we would have to, discuss is how they can translate their working experience and the skills they've obtained from working into how that translates to be a great researcher. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so but I think we'll talk a lot more, Tunde and Olamide will talk a lot more about the statement of purpose, because I think it's in this year, and the letter of recommendation in this year will be a lot more significant since the GRE for some schools, they are not accepting the GRE at all.
And then the other variable I just like to flag is that once a university or department receives all of the materials, the letters of recommendation, the statement of purpose, test scores, transcripts, then they sit together and they evaluate all of the applications, and there's a discussion. And so what you want to do to be strategic, if you can, is to have somebody in that discussion who understands who you are, who has a sense of who you are. So how does that happen? That's where researching the faculty in the department becomes really important. And so if you're applying to, say, molecular engineering at the University of Chicago, you go on the website, there are faculty bios and list of research interests. You survey that, and you look at a body of faculty that you'd be interested in working with, and then you send them emails. You send them emails introducing yourself. Maybe you include a CV or a resume, and you say, I'd really love to learn more about your program, or I'd really love to learn more about your research interest. Don't say, oh, I'm applying and I'm hoping that you can speak for me. Just very vague. I'd like to learn more about your program. Then that becomes an opening for you to have a conversation with a faculty member within the department. And then you can talk about why you want to join that department. And you can ask questions, actually will help you as you form your personal statement and put your application together, because they'll tell you, they'll give you inside information, because it's not a big secret, it's just not published. So they might say, oh yes, we're really expanding our materials area. So there are going to be a lot of new faculty who are going to be recruiting students this year. Or they'll say, no one really cares about the GPA. Yes, no one really cares about the GRE. Whatever that is, that's extra information that you can glean for your application, preparing your application. And then the other thing is that person will remember you when we're deliberating. So when we're looking at 300 students and we're trying to compare all of these really talented students, the difference between a talented student that I've had a conversation with and a talented student that I've never spoken to is a lot, right? Because now I have an impression of you. This is a really serious student. This is a really personable student. This is a really enthusiastic student. I have extra information that I can share with my colleagues on the admissions committee. And so that's, again, something that's not published, and it's not something that a lot of students do, but it's something that our most successful students do. And so that's the other bit of information I would pass on.
Tunde, I think you wanted to jump in.
So actually, I had a question for Rovana. So two questions. One is, given that GPAs are hard to put in context for most people on the admissions committee, does it help for the student to help the reader put it in context of, for example, saying that, I have a 4.5 out of 5.0, but I'm, the second best in my department or something like that. So does this kind of things help?
It helps most if there's an objective party who's saying that. So if somebody who's writing your letter of recommendation can put you in context. And so it would be important for them to say that Tunde is a wonderful researcher. He's in the top 5% of all of the students that I've worked with, or he is a top scholar and has been recognized by the faculty or the university in this way. Or if the recommender has studied in the United States and they say, I studied at MIT, I would put this student in the top 10% of the students that I've worked with at MIT. That gives them some information. It's good if the student says it, but it's like, I don't know whether or not to trust that. Saying it actually really helps. And you might want to tell the recommender that, because recommenders aren't always aware of the US system. And so giving them some bullet points to address in the letter is actually helpful.
Okay, great. Now my second question is around what you said about reaching out to professors. The way you've described it, it only kind of works if the people or the person that you reached out to happen to be on the admissions committee. So there's a kind of like hit or miss there, right?
Not necessarily. So what happens is there is an admissions committee. And so maybe that at the PME, actually everyone is involved in admissions. That's not necessarily how it is at all universities, but there is a system to collect information from faculty who have interacted with students. All departments want to recruit the best students, right? And every faculty member has a different idea of what the best student looks like, because they're recruiting students into their labs. And so if you have a conversation with me and I think you're great, and I think, well, this is a student that I could see in my department, and certainly a student that I could see working with me in my lab, I'm going to pass that information to the admissions committee. And I will say, look out for Tunde's application. I think he's a really strong student, and I want to make sure that he's not overlooked. That's how the information gets back to the admissions committee if it doesn't involve everybody.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah, so also, I think you also mentioned, Rovana, something about quotas, whereby, so if you indicate in your statement of purpose that you're interested in working on theory, but if that department for that year, the theory faculty they don't have either funding or are not interested in getting students, for some reason, the number of theory students shrink that year. And so it really does help to email, even if all they can tell you is that, we're looking for more material science students. That information can help you. So you could be a great student any year, but it just so happened that year, the theory faculty or the computation faculty only want 2 students. And so they are not going to admit, they know that 50% of their students decide to come in. And so they're only going to admit 4 because they know 50%, and they will get to the number that they have funding for. So that's also something that information can help you with.
And they might also say, we're not recruiting students this year, but I have colleagues at MIT or UC Berkeley that are building a department. And I think you're a strong student. You should apply to those schools. So sometimes they give you advice. It's not across the board, but what you're doing is just doing some research. Some people will respond, others won't. But if you can get one person to have a substantive conversation with you, you'll actually benefit quite a bit.
So I guess one final thing I can say before so Chiamaka can continue is when you email that person, first of all, the email ID you use better be professional, right? You need to have a professional email looking ID, not some random ID you set up when you were in secondary school. The email you send, the content of that email needs to be professional. So you don't want to send something that is like a whole page long, and then you randomly are bolding some things and randomly you're italicizing something. So it needs to be a paragraph that is short and sweet about who you are, about what you want to get from them, and then attach your professionally made CV. So at the end of the workshop, I'll send like a good CV template for everybody to be able to use. So what you want to do is, if you come across as somebody that is professional and serious, that goes a long way in actually allowing them to respond to you. But if they see they get a lot of random emails, and so there's no incentive for them to reply if they see that this is like a shoddy job. So Chiamaka, I'll let you continue.
Yeah.
Sorry, so before you continue, Chiamaka, just 2 more things on this page. One, this is probably not super important, but I found it useful to, so at some point you have to kind of select the schools you want to go to. And there's like a whole process on how you kind of like, settle on the 4 or 6 or 10 schools you want to apply to, depending on how much you have and what your interests are. During my final selection of the schools I wanted to go to, I made sure that the combination of schools would require the least amount of work for me, right? So for example, MIT at that time was transitioning towards only requiring IELTS and not TOEFL. So I need to make sure that I wasn't writing GRE, TOEFL, and IELTS, which would cost me more money, take me more time. So consider things like that as well. So if you for some reason don't want to take the GRE, which as you've heard, probably not a good idea. You could also say, I'm applying to these 4 schools, these 4 departments that do not require that. And if you know that some schools, you're applying to 5 schools and 4 of them require TOEFL, and you want to go write IELTS just for this other school that just happens to require that, that's just more stress on you. So research that before you you go too far. Oh, sorry, that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you have a situation that you have a question about, or you need you need someone to waive something for you, please ask. Most admissions pages, websites of schools would have an email address of someone you can reach out to. So if you for some reason can't write GRE because there were protests in Nigeria at that time, or your recommendations were coming a few days later than it showed, don't be quiet. Reach out to that email address and they will tell you what's possible. Sometimes they will try to help you out.
All right, all great points. Just one final thing, something Rovana said that I think is really important is, you may reach out to a lot of professors that won't get back to you, and don't take it personally. Like, professors are busy. Typically send another email or 2, but just be aware that not everybody you reach out to will get back to you. Okay, cool. All right, so we're done. And we already had a bit about the recommendation letter, but I think one very important thing about the recommendation letter, and something Rovana mentioned, is that it allows the admissions committee to learn about you, but from a colleague's perspective. So from a third party who isn't you, from your statement of purpose. And so it's a really important component of the application process. So some of the things on just the recommendation letter in general is that you want to contact a professor who knows you well. So it's not enough for them to just know your name or to know that you're like a student in their class, but they really have to know you well. And some of the things that can show that like this person knows you well is you want them to be able to speak on your ability to conduct research. So the person that you did your final year project with would be a good letter writer. Someone you've also worked closely with. you can also get them to tailor the recommendation letter to what an admissions committee would be looking for. Your recommendation letter also needs to show that you've demonstrated excellence and, you know, that you can learn quickly. A really important key there is you also want the letter to show that you have the potential to succeed in a graduate program. Because when professors or like a hiring committee is reading your packet, they want to know, why should we bring this person on to our program? Will they succeed? Will they thrive in this graduate environment? And then you also want your recommendation letters writers to point out qualities that make you stand out from other applicants. So what makes you a unique candidate? If you were really heavily involved in this activity on campus, right? So maybe leading the chemical engineering organization on campus, it would be good for you to say it in your statement of purpose, but also if your letter writer can comment on that and why it would be relevant for the graduate degree, I think it's also something that would help you stand out. And then just some tips with that is, again, professors are busy, lecturers are busy, your managers and bosses are busy. So ask for the letters in advance. I said 2 months, but maybe you want to take that with a grain of salt. Just ask for it in advance so that they don't feel rushed. And so you can send reminders and it doesn't look like you're hustling them to a deadline. Provide your resume and your statement of purpose to the letter writers. And the statement of purpose doesn't have to be the final draft at this point, because it's just like you'll learn, the statement of purpose is a living document that you can keep editing. But your statement of purpose is so that you can give the professor or the person writing the letter an idea of what you're saying and what your profile is, or the things you're saying about yourself, so that they can either comment or buttress or support that idea. And then Rovana mentioned this, but also emphasize what you want them to include. So maybe give them an outline of the things that would be good to include in their letter, just so everybody, you and the letter writers, are all speaking with one voice. Something that I don't think is said enough, but I think it's super important to thank your letter writers afterwards. And nobody tells you this, but that's not the last time you're going to need a letter from them. And so even when you get into graduate school, there are a lot of different programs and fellowships and things that still require you to lean on those letter writers. And so it's important to thank them so that they're eager to write it for you again the next time. And I have one final. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Rovana, can you jump in on, I think in this year I got to read applications, and I think there are differences between when an American professor writes a letter versus when an international professor writes a letter. Could you kind of comment on what we should be telling the international letter writer to emphasize? Because I tend to see you have maybe one paragraph that just says this person did well in my class, it's a top ranked student, and that's it. So if you can give some comments on that.
Yeah, I think it's in line with what I've said before. It's context. And so when your letter writer says you're a top ranked student, they know what that means, but the people reading the letter won't. And so adding extra details like top rank means what? How does a student fit in with all of the students I've mentored or taught? So where am I? And you want to have a conversation with the letter writer. So I've had situations where students have asked me for a letter of recommendation, and I don't think very highly of the student. And so I tell the student, oh, I don't have a lot of time, or maybe you should ask Professor Smith for the letter. And the student says, well, no, I really need a letter. And so they push me. And then I say, okay, you want a letter? I'll give you a letter. It's not going to be the letter you want, but I'll give you a letter. And so you have to have a conversation where if you get a sense that this person doesn't think very highly of you, or they're not invested in your success, stop and find someone else to write the letter. And so that actually, you're laughing, Chiamaka, because you probably have heard of situations like this. But sometimes students can be very persistent and they're not taking in information. And so the letter and that's, I think, sometimes why we get very brief letters. And a very brief letter can be a nail in a coffin. And so they want to say something about your personality. They'll want to say something about how you rank among all of the students that they've worked with. They'll want to say something about projections for long-term success. Do they think that you would actually be successful pursuing study at a US institution, and why? So giving the why is super, super important. And then if there's something special about you that maybe they know that other people don't know, so something that's actually really important. I've had a student with a C in a class get a letter of recommendation from the professor in that class. And that probably, a C is like middle range. It's definitely not at the top. And that sounds like, why would that student ask for a letter of recommendation from a professor who gave them a middle range grade? That seems counterintuitive. But no, it wasn't. The student took a graduate level course when they were in their first or second year of their undergraduate program. And so they got a C while competing with people in a PhD program. So the professor was able to give context to say, even at a second year level in the university, this student was able to hold his own among graduate students. He took a huge risk in taking this class, but he was super ambitious. And now I can see 2 years have advanced, he would be at the top of any graduate program. And so sometimes we only ask for letters from the professors that gave us an A. But if that professor knows something about you and your ambition, your ability to stick with a problem in the face of difficulty, if there's been something challenging in your upbringing or your family, that professor could say, yes, that student got a B. But had that student not faced these other challenges, the student would have been at the top of the class. And I think the student will be totally successful when they enter your program. So there are lots of different bits of information that the letter writer can share that you wouldn't know about. And so at the end of this panel, I volunteered to Chibueze to say that he can share my email address, and I will. I'm really busy, but I will definitely try to answer your email if you put in the header that you participated in this program. And I can talk to you about some of those things because the story will be different for every student. So if you've had a challenge or an unusual circumstance and you're not sure whether to share it, but you know it's impacted your academic record, I can talk to you about how to frame that so that it's actually seen as a plus in an admissions committee.
And Tunde, do you, especially coming from Nigeria and having asked for letters, like any things we should think about from that end?
So the most common question I get from students is, should I try to solve for someone who is famous versus someone who knows me well? And I would always say that go for the latter. For a couple of reasons. First reason is that the person that you think is famous might not be really that famous. So, you know, the people in the molecular science department at University of Chicago probably don't know who Dr. Professor Lawyer is, right? It might be the best professor in Nigeria, but they don't know who he is. So like, don't try to solve for that. And two, is the second reason is the thing that Rovana already mentioned, which is that, you know, if they don't know you well enough, they will just give you a very, very, very lackluster recommendation, that is very, very short. And that would do more harm than good, no matter who they are, even if they're the president of the country. So try to, you know, get people that really like you and they're invested in your success. And they have something to say, not just that they, you know, you're related to them in some way and they really want you to succeed, but they have a story to tell. They've taught you, or they were a supervisor at work, and they have something concrete to say about you, right? Last thing, and this point is kind of hard, but most Nigerian professors actually don't know how to write recommendations. And that is where the conversation comes in. And if in some cases they might show you what they're planning to send, and if you have any thoughts, if you've like read up on what recommendations should look like, try to be involved in that process. For some people, it's like they just don't know how to write well. They might have the right intentions, they just don't know what to do, right? For others, it's just that they just don't, just have the right content, which you should have sought for before. So assuming that the professors just don't know how to write it, you could connect them with people that know how to, maybe other lecturers, or you yourself might need to get in that process. Last thing I would talk about here is the recommendation that I think got me into MIT. The lecturer shared the recommendation with me. He just had a PhD. He actually got his PhD the year before I applied, so it wasn't like any highly ranked professor or anything like that. But there were some things he said in the letter that I think were really, really good. One thing he said is that I was consistently the best student in his class, in my classes, and that my performance made me the best the department has trained in 30 years. I didn't know that. Is it factually correct? I don't know. He's only been in the department for 15 years or so. Then lastly, he said something. So there's something Rovana said about the ability of a student to succeed in a US university. Now, he did his PhD in Unilag, where I went to. So he had no context to say anything about my ability to succeed at least directly, to succeed in MIT. But he added a sentence that said, Tunde ranks higher in academic ability than our former student that was also admitted directly for PhD at Princeton University. Yes. Right? So even though he didn't have a direct way to say, he didn't go to any school abroad, but he knew students that were admitted to schools abroad, and he was able to just put that comparison there.
Yes. Yeah.
And there was other things about, being diligent and blah, 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 blah. But I think that first paragraph where he stated all this stuff were really, really strong pointers to the admission committee.
Yeah. So on that note, I'll ask, there's a question from Daniel on the chat. So we've kind of emphasized getting letters from professors and lecturers. So what about getting a letter from somebody who you worked with at a company? How does that also come in? Rovana, I can pass this to you.
I would say that that's typically the fourth letter, and if necessary, the third letter. So if you can't get 4 letters of recommendation, make sure you have 2 that are academic letters, because you're applying to go to an academic environment. But with that said, maybe you've done research in industry. So maybe you didn't do research actually during your academic studies, but you took a job where you were leading research, engaged in research, and then you want to make sure that that person talks about your research strengths. And again, maybe that person has insight into studying abroad and they can talk a little bit about that, but they really want to talk about your ability to conduct research and your ability to be successful in an academic program. If they can talk about that and give sort of tangible examples, then I think it can be fine. But you'll really want to have a conversation, again, following the advice that's already been given by everybody on the panel, as you want to talk with them about your goals, you want to talk with them about the expectations for the schools, and maybe give them some bullet points on things to address.
Okay. Chiamaka, we have 2 more minutes for you. So let's see how much you can rush through.
Okay. All great points. CV would not be belabored. Application fee can also be waived, like they mentioned earlier. So reach out to the department if you're in a unique situation. So on this slide, there are other slides I want to get to, but on this slide, I was just going to say, and I think Rovana mentioned this earlier, and she put it beautifully, that there's not an ideal PhD applicant, really. The professors are just looking for a good fit, right? So does the research you want to do fit into what the department does? Can the faculty see you fitting in? Are your goals something that the department can meet? Those are some of the things that they're looking at when they look at your application packet. So don't worry about, being an ideal, or don't spend too much time worrying about what an ideal PhD applicant looks like. And then, okay, I think this is probably one of the like most super important things that people asked. Who pays for graduate school? You know, who funds the program? And there are many different ways. And so in this figure, for you guys who are like, you know, engineers mostly and scientists, primarily graduate school is fully funded by the departments in most schools. So this first chart is just showing you that amongst the people that were surveyed, 90% of them had funding from the institution themselves. So, and from that, so from like that school, the funding can be broken up into like different sources. So 35% of them are like research assistantships. And that is when professors pay, so you're admitted as a graduate research assistant, and then you get a stipend, but your primary role is research. As a graduate research assistant. Your tuition is also covered from the professor pays for your tuition. And this is from their grants that they have to hire you. And then the next biggest fund is the 13%, well, actually not 28% is, but the 13% here is just teaching assistantship. So this is the second, I would argue, like most common way students are funded. And as a teaching assistant, you're primarily, so it depends based on like school and departments, but as a teaching assistant, you have to do your role, so you have to do some teaching, so assisting the professors to either lectures or leading labs or grading, in addition to doing research. And this is typically for people who don't have, so there's sometimes professors don't have a lot of funding. And research-wise, and so the department can actually hire you, in addition to that, to teach while you do research. And then there's a third one, graduate assistantships, but that's not really necessary. So I was just going to go into but I already mentioned this briefly. So as a graduate research assistant, your primary role will be to conduct research. And this is what covers most people. Your tuition is paid for, and then you also get a stipend to cover your living expenses. This is what most people will be hired as. And then the graduate teaching assistants, where you would have to do like some teaching in addition to your research. And then I just wanted to give some tips about just funding in general. So reach out to the schools. Typically, once you're admitted in your offer letter, they tell you how you're going to be funded. And it's very different for different schools. But if somehow you're not funded by a GRA, so if you don't have those graduate research assistantships, then the next step would be to ask about teaching like assistantships. And, you know, so both master's and PhD students can do this. The third point I wanted to make is that the funding situation of professors can and may change while you're getting your degree. So 3 years in, your professor's grants might run out, and then you have to teach for a period of time. It's not necessarily, it's not the end of the world. People have done it, and people like still get their PhD. So just keep an open mind. But there are also other ways to supplement your PhD. So there are fellowships, which most of them are American, or for American students, and you can't qualify for them. But there are a few you can qualify for. So there's a NASA, this is like specific NASA fellowship, if like that's within your field, that you can apply to. There's also the AAUW, which is for women. They have a lot of women international fellowships that people can also apply to. And I know 2 people who have gotten fellowships that way. The department also sometimes has internal fellowships that you can also apply for. And then there are also scholarships. So a lot of different like engineering organizations like the National Society of Black Engineers or Society of Women Engineers have scholarships that you can apply to that can also all supplement the research assistantship you always have. So in general, money is typically, you don't have to worry about paying tuition, and you typically get a stipend for most PhD students. And the amounts, and that varies depending on the situation. Okay, So really, how much time do I have to visit? Do I have like 3 minutes?
Yeah, you have like minus 4 minutes.
Okay,
But yeah,
okay.
to just wrap, one thing I'll let you
Yeah.
finish this slide, because this is also a slide that people add a lot of questions for. So these slides, I'll provide it. I will send everyone an email with this slide. So if there was anything you, Chiamaka, skipped because of time, you can go back and find more information. But Chiamaka, you can work on this slide for like 1 more minute.
Okay. All right. All right, cool. That's it. The average length of the PhD program is typically 4 to 6 years. And that really depends on your program, what your research is based on. If you have a master's, that doesn't really change anything, because typically you start off your PhD your first year or so by taking classes. And then there are a lot of qualifying exams that you have to take afterwards, and then you start research. So it takes really 4 to 6 years. 4 years if your research is more computational for a lot of people, and then 6 years if your research is more like biology and science focused. So somewhere around there is what people graduate. For international students, which will be like all of you, you need an F1 student visa. And one of the things that I think is like super important to highlight here is so a lot of time, if you're going to the bachelor's program, you need to show proof that you can pay your fees during your F1 visa interview. But if you're going for a graduate program, so a PhD that's fully funded, you don't have to show like proof of payment, because your I-20, which is a document you get once you're admitted, shows that it's a fully funded program. So that's one less thing to worry about. And then the process of choosing an advisor just varies between departments and schools. So sometimes you're admitted to a specific lab. In some schools, they try and match you in your first and second semester. And in some other schools, you get to rotate to different labs. So that's just really lab specific. And that's it. That's okay. Really all.
Yeah. So I think on the point on choosing advisors, I think for the current student panel, and so our panel 3, that would be a good time to ask some of the panelists like how it works at their university, because they're all from different universities and different labs. So I think with that, any parting points, Tunde and Rovana, before we switch gears? All good?
I would just say that if they want you in the school, they will help you find funding. And so if you're a good match, they will help you find funding. So that shouldn't be as much of a concern as actually getting into a good program.
Okay.
Okay, I think the last word for me on the funding thing, there was a slide that Chiamaka shared on how much PhDs earn. During the PhD program, for some of you, you actually earn more in absolute terms as a student than whatever you're earning currently, or what you might earn in 1 year after graduating from a Nigerian university. So don't worry about money if you do get into a school and get funding. In fact, I was sending money home when I was a student.
Okay. Thank you, Tunde. Thank you, Rovana. Thank you, Chiamaka.